My hands trembled as I slid the key into the front door lock of my own home, only to find it wouldn't turn. 3 weeks at my mother's bedside, watching her fade away a little more each day, and now this. I couldn't even get into my own house. I tried again, the metal scraping uselessly against unfamiliar tumblers, before the truth hit me. Andrew had changed the locks while I was gone. I had lost my mother yesterday, and today, it seemed I had lost my home too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen on the porch, my suitcase still beside me, the evening air turning cold against my tear-stained cheeks. 20 years of marriage, and he couldn't even wait until my mother was in the ground before making his move. The realization wasn't as shocking. As it should have been, I had suspected for months that something was happening behind my back. The late-night phone calls he took in the garage, the unexplained withdrawals from our joint account, the way his demeanor completely changed when my mother's diagnosis forced me to split my time between our home and her hospice care. The porch. Light flickered on automatically as darkness fell, illuminating a small package tucked beside the welcome mat. A mat that read, "Home Sweet Home," in faded letters that now felt like a cruel joke. I picked up the package, a simple manila envelope with my name, Elena, written in Andrew's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a new key, a folded note, and what appeared to be several bank statements. The note was brief, almost clinical. Elena, things have changed. Use this key for now. We'll talk when you're ready. A. I stared at his words, my grief over Mom momentarily overshadowed by a strange calmness that settled over me. This wasn't just about changed locks. This was Andrew making. His first move in a game he thought he'd already won. What he didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this moment longer than he knew. The new key worked, of course. Andrew was nothing if not practical. He wouldn't leave me literally homeless, just off balance enough to give him control of whatever came next. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home now tinged with something different, a cologne Andrew never wore. I wheeled my suitcase into the entryway, surveying what had once been our shared space. Everything looked almost the same, yet subtly different. Furniture slightly rearranged, new throw pillows on the couch, unfamiliar dishes drying on the kitchen rack. Someone else had been here, making themselves comfortable in my absence. In the living room, I noticed immediately what was missing. The wall of family photos, our wedding, our trips, holiday gatherings with my side of the family, had been cleared, replaced with minimalist artwork I'd never seen before. The only photos remaining were of Andrew with his family and colleagues. 20 years of our shared life, carefully curated away during my absence. I set down the envelope on the coffee table and moved through the house like a detective at a crime scene, noting each change, each erasure of my existence. Our bedroom told the clearest story. Andrew's clothes neatly arranged in what had once been our shared closet, the vanity cleared of my perfumes and jewelry, the bathroom cabinet emptied of my prescriptions and toiletries. Everything of mine had been boxed up and moved to the guest room down the hall. The boxes were labeled in a handwriting that wasn't Andrew's. Elena's clothes, Elena's books, Elena's personal items. Neat, impersonal, like I was being processed out of my own life by a third party. I ran my finger along the handwriting, another piece of evidence to file away. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call Andrew demanding an explanation. Instead, I returned to the living room, settled into what had once been my reading chair, now reupholstered in a fabric I would never have chosen, and opened the bank statements from the envelope. They were for an account I didn't recognize, in both our names, showing systematic withdrawals over the past 6 months. Always in cash, always for amounts between $2,000 and $5,000. Nearly $70,000 in total, siphoned away while I split my time between work and my dying mother's bedside. Money that had disappeared from our joint savings, now documented in this phantom account I'd never signed for. I should have felt rage. I should have felt betrayed. Instead, I felt a cold clarity washing over me. I reached for my phone and took photographs of each statement, each withdrawal, each forged signature. Then I texted a single message to my sister Margot. "It's happening. Plan B." Her response came seconds later. "On it. Stay at the house?" "Yes," I replied. "He needs to think he has the upper hand." I set my phone down and retrieved my laptop from my suitcase. The guest room Wi-Fi password had been changed, but I didn't need it. I had something better. The small portable drive I'd kept with me through the entire ordeal of Mom's final weeks. While Andrew thought I'd been too distracted by grief and obligation to notice what was happening, I'd been quietly gathering my own evidence, preparing for exactly this scenario. The changed locks weren't a surprise. They were confirmation. And his careful documentation of the money he'd stolen wasn't the smoking gun he feared I might discover. It was just one more piece of evidence to add to my collection. I powered up the laptop and plugged in the drive, entering the encryption password, Mom's birthday, and the name of her childhood street, a combination no one, not even Andrew, would think to try. The files loaded, organized by date and category: financial records, text message transcripts, photos, recorded conversations, and a detailed timeline of Andrew's activities dating back 18 months. Mom had been the first to notice something was off. "Elena, honey, watch your accounts," she'd warned during a rare moment of clarity in her early days of treatment. "Andrew's eyes have gone cold when he looks at you. I've seen that look before." She'd seen it from my father, 30 years earlier, before he'd emptied their accounts and disappeared with his secretary, leaving her to raise me and Margot alone. Like mother, like daughter, except I had learned from her experience. When the first signs appeared, Andrew's unexplained absences, password changes, hushed phone calls, I hadn't confronted him. I had watched, documented, and prepared. As I scrolled through the evidence on my drive, a text from Margot lit up my phone. "Lawyer confirmed for 9 a.m. PI report just came in, sending now. It's worse than we thought." I opened the attachment, a detailed surveillance report with photographs that confirmed what I had suspected for months. Andrew hadn't just been planning a financial escape. He'd been building a whole new life with someone else. Someone who had now been helping him erase me from our home while I sat vigil at my mother's deathbed. The final photo in the report showed Andrew and a woman I recognized, Rebecca Myers, his administrative assistant, entering our home together 3 days ago, carrying shopping bags from high-end furniture stores. The same day Mom had slipped into her final coma. The same day I'd called Andrew, sobbing, telling him I needed him to come to the hospice. He had claimed he was stuck at an emergency meeting at work. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the unfamiliar chair. Tomorrow, Andrew would return, expecting to find me broken, disoriented, and weakened by grief. A woman who had just lost her mother and discovered her marriage was over in the span of 48 hours. What he would find instead was someone else entirely. Someone who had been watching and waiting. Someone who had learned from generations of women before her not to trust a man whose eyes had gone cold. I picked up my phone and made one final text to Margot. "Coming home tomorrow expecting a funeral. He'll get one, just not the one he's expecting." Then I headed to the guest room to unpack. After all, this was still my house, and Andrew had just handed me the keys to his downfall. I woke to the sound of keys in the front door. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains in the guest room, gauzy white things that offered little privacy, nothing like the blackout drapes I'd hung throughout the house years ago. My phone showed 7:34 a.m. Andrew was right on schedule. I remained perfectly still, listening as he moved through the house with the confident stride of someone who believed they owned everything within these walls. The refrigerator opened and, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Closed. Cabinet doors thumped. The coffee maker gurgled to life. He was fixing breakfast as if this were any normal day, as if my mother hadn't died 2 days ago, as if he hadn't systematically worked to erase me from our home. I rose silently, grateful I'd thought to shower and dress before going to bed. The black dress I'd worn to say goodbye to Mom still hung on the bathroom door. I would need it again soon, but not this morning. This morning called for something different. A crisp white blouse and charcoal slacks, an outfit that said competent, composed, in control. My closing argument outfit from my days as a corporate attorney before I'd stepped back to part-time consultation work when Andrew's career needed to take priority. I slipped my phone into my pocket and opened the guest room door. Andrew stood at the kitchen island, his back to me, broad shoulders hunched slightly as he scrolled through his phone. He was dressed in the expensive charcoal suit I'd given him for our anniversary last year, his dark hair freshly cut in a style slightly shorter than he usually wore it, a style that matched the business photos of ambitious executives featured in the financial magazines he devoured. "Good morning, Andrew," I said, my voice steady and neutral. He startled, nearly dropping his phone, then turned with a carefully composed expression of somber concern. "Elena, you're up early." He set his phone down, screen side down. "I wasn't sure when you'd get in. I checked the hospice yesterday, but they said you'd already left." I leaned against the doorframe, observing him like a specimen under glass. "I arrived last night. Your new key works perfectly." A flicker of something, relief, worry, crossed his face before settling into a practiced look of apologetic discomfort. He'd been rehearsing this moment, I realized. Perhaps with Rebecca, beside him, coaching him through his lines. "About that," he began, picking up his coffee mug. "I should explain the locks? Or the redecorating? Or perhaps the $70,000 you've been siphoning from our accounts?" I kept my tone conversational, as if discussing weekend plans rather than the systematic dismantling of our marriage. His hand tightened around the mug. "You found the statements?" "You left them for me to find," I corrected him. "The question is why? Did you think documenting your theft would somehow make it less illegal?" Andrew's jaw tightened. That familiar twitch that appeared whenever his carefully constructed narratives were challenged. It used to make me back down, eager to smooth away his displeasure. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. He had expected tears, confusion, a desperate need for explanation. He had prepared for weakness. My clarity had thrown him off script. "It's not theft when it's marital assets, Elena." His voice took on the condescending tone he used with junior associates at his firm. "I've been moving our money to a more secure account after I noticed some concerning patterns with our regular bank. I was protecting our finances." I almost admired the smoothness of the lie. "Almost. Is that what you're calling it now? Financial protection?" I moved toward the kitchen but stopped at the peninsula counter, maintaining distance between us. "And I suppose changing the locks was for protection too? Moving my belongings, removing our wedding photos?" He sighed heavily, setting down his coffee with deliberate care. "I can see this is going to be difficult. You're upset about your mother, which is completely understandable. But you're conflating separate issues." "Am I?" "Yes," he said firmly, slipping easily into the role of the rational party dealing with an emotional woman. "The locks needed changing after a break-in attempt last week. I tried calling you about it, but you weren't answering consistently." Another lie. My phone showed no missed calls from him in the past 10 days, only brief text responses to my updates about Mom's condition. "The redecorating was meant to be a surprise," he continued. "You've been saying for years that you wanted to refresh the place. Rebecca helped me pick out some things I thought you might like." At the mention of her name, I watched his expression carefully. "Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition that he'd just introduced his accomplice, his lover, into the conversation. "Rebecca has excellent taste," I said mildly. "Those pillows look expensive." Confusion crossed his features briefly. This wasn't how he expected me to respond. Where were the accusations? The jealous questions? The emotional outburst that would let him paint me as unstable? "She helped me choose a few things," he said cautiously. "As a favor." How generous of her, especially considering how busy she must be handling both your professional and personal affairs. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly are you implying, Elena?" "I'm not implying anything," I replied, moving toward the refrigerator and opening it as if this were any normal morning. "I'm simply noting Rebecca's extraordinary dedication. Managing your schedule, helping you redecorate our home, accompanying you to furniture stores 3 days ago, the same day my mother entered her final coma." The color drained from Andrew's face. "You've been having me followed?" I poured myself a glass of orange juice, noting it wasn't the brand I usually bought. "That's an interesting conclusion to jump to, Andrew. Why would you assume that? You just said—" He stopped himself, recalibrating. "I meant that you're making assumptions about a work colleague helping me with a simple errand." I took a sip of juice, then placed the glass down carefully. "Let's not do this dance, Andrew. It's beneath both of us. You've been planning your exit for months, moving money, establishing a relationship with Rebecca, waiting for the right moment to make your move." I gestured around the redecorated space. "You just miscalculated the timing. You thought I'd be at the hospice longer." His expression hardened, the pretense of concern replaced by cold calculation. His true face, the one I'd glimpsed with increasing frequency over the past year. "Fine," he said flatly. "I've wanted out for a while. I tried to make it easier by handling things while you were occupied with your mother. The money is just a fair division of assets, money I earned while you worked part-time." The casual cruelty of his timing wasn't lost on me, but I didn't flinch. "That's your position? That my mother's death was an inconvenient scheduling issue in your exit strategy?" He shrugged, an elegant lifting of expensive wool-clad shoulders. "I'm being practical. The marriage is over, Elena. Has been for some time. I've already consulted with my attorney and I'm prepared to be generous in the settlement. But I'd prefer if you found somewhere else to stay while we sort out the details." He gestured toward the guest room. "Those arrangements were meant to be temporary." "I see," I said quietly. "And whose name is on the deed to this house, Andrew?" His confidence didn't waver. "It's marital property. My income paid the mortgage. For the past 15 years. I smiled for the first time since entering the kitchen. That wasn't my question. Something in my expression must have alerted him that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he masked it. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," he said, shifting tactics. "I know. You're grieving. Take some time. The funeral is tomorrow, isn't it? We can discuss the separation after you've had a chance to say goodbye to your mother." "How considerate of you," I replied, my voice soft but steady. "And will Rebecca be attending the funeral as well? I should make sure there's space for her in the family section." The question landed like a slap. Andrew's mask slipped completely, replaced by cold anger. "That's unnecessary," he snapped, "and frankly, inappropriate." "Is it?" I thought she was just a helpful colleague. I picked up my juice glass again. "Unless there's something more I should know about your relationship with your administrative assistant?" He looked at me then, really looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. What he saw seemed to disturb him. "What do you want, Elena?" he asked finally, all pretense gone. I held his gaze steadily. "I want you to understand exactly what you've done, and what's coming next." Andrew's question hung in the air between us. "What do you want, Elena?" Such a simple question with such a complex answer. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? My old life back? None of those seemed quite right. I want what's fair, I said finally, setting my juice glass down. Nothing more, nothing less. He relaxed, visibly, shoulders dropping as he leaned against the counter. This was familiar territory for him. Negotiations, settlements, the language of compromise. Andrew had built his legal career on finding the weakest point in his opposition and exploiting it. Fair is reasonable, he said, slipping back into his attorney voice. I can have my lawyer draft an initial proposal this week. We can split the major assets, liquidate what needs to be sold. The sooner we start, the sooner we can both move on. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his offer. And what would you consider fair regarding the $70,000 you've already moved? That's part of my personal settlement, he replied smoothly. Compensation for my greater contribution to our marital assets. I see. And the cabin in Vermont, the one my grandfather left me, that I owned before we were married, the one that's still solely in my name? Is that part of your fair division too? His expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. The cabin has appreciated significantly during our marriage, primarily due to renovations. I paid for. That makes the appreciation a marital asset. Interesting legal theory, I mused. And the Bergman account? Is that why you forged my signature on the withdrawal documents? Because you considered it your personal settlement? Andrew's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. I didn't forge anything. You signed those transfer authorizations last year. If you don't remember, that's hardly my fault. I reached for my phone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it up. On display was a document from our bank, dated 3 months ago, with a signature that resembled mine authorizing a transfer of $20,000 to the account I'd just discovered. This signature, I said calmly. The one with the loop in the E that I've never made in my life. The one made on a day when I was in Boston with my mother for her first round of intensive treatment. The authorization that the bank already has under investigation for fraud. The color drained from Andrew's face. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. How much I knew, what evidence I had, how this could affect his carefully constructed exit strategy. He set his mug down carefully. The bank made a mistake. I had your permission to move those funds. Did you have my permission to sleep with Rebecca too? The question was deliberate, not because I cared about the affair itself, but because I needed to see how he would handle direct confrontation about it. His response would tell me everything about his next moves. Andrew didn't disappoint. His expression hardened, then cleared into something almost pitying. I understand you're looking for someone to blame right now, Elena. Your mother just died, and you're lashing out. But inventing conspiracies and making accusations about Rebecca won't help either of us. Denial, gaslighting, dismissal. Exactly as I'd expected. I'm not inventing anything, Andrew, I said quietly. But I won't argue with you about facts we both know to be true. Let me be very clear about what happens next. I moved to the living room, where my laptop sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it the night before. Andrew followed, his body language shifting from confident to wary. You have 2 options, I continued, not looking at him as I opened the computer. Option 1. We proceed exactly as you've planned. You file for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences. You work with your attorney to secure the most advantageous settlement possible. You continue to deny any impropriety regarding our finances or your relationship with Rebecca. He remained silent, watching me carefully. In that scenario, I continued, typing my password to unlock the screen, I will be forced to submit all my evidence to the court, to the Bar Association's Ethics Committee, and to the managing partners at your firm. The evidence of financial fraud, the documentation of your affair with a subordinate, and the timeline showing how you deliberately timed your actions to coincide with my mother's illness and death. The blood drained from Andrew's face. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I turned the laptop toward him. On screen was a folder labeled simply Andrew, containing dozens of subfolders with dates reaching back 18 months. I don't bluff, I said softly. I prepare. With methodical precision, I opened one of the subfolders from 3 months earlier. Inside were bank statements, phone records, text message screenshots, and hotel receipts, all meticulously organized and annotated. This is just 1 month's worth of documentation, I explained, my voice utterly calm. I have 18 months of similar evidence. Every unauthorized financial transaction. Every meeting with Rebecca outside of office hours. Every lie you told me about working late when you were actually at the Meridian Hotel downtown. I paused, letting the information sink in. I even have the receipt for the engagement ring you purchased last month. Emerald cut, 1.8 carats. Rebecca's birthstone, if I'm not mistaken. Andrew stared at the screen, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. How did you... he began, then stopped himself. How did I know? I completed his thought. I'm a former corporate attorney who specialized in forensic accounting, Andrew. Did you forget that? I started noticing discrepancies in our accounts over a year ago. At first, I thought it was just carelessness. Then I realized it was systematic. I closed the laptop gently. Which brings me to option 2. Andrew had recovered. Enough to cross his arms defensively. And what's that? You acknowledge what you've done. You return every dollar you took without authorization. You agree to an equitable division of our actual marital assets, not the division you've unilaterally decided upon. You leave this house, which is still legally in my name, and you find somewhere else to live while the divorce proceeds. His eyes narrowed. And if I agree to these terms? Then the evidence remains private. Your career remains intact. Your reputation undamaged. I met his gaze steadily. I have no interest in destroying you, Andrew. I just won't allow you to destroy me. A heavy silence settled between us as Andrew processed what I'd said. I could see him analyzing his options, weighing risks against benefits, searching for a third alternative that would let him maintain control. You've been planning this for some time, he said finally. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I learned from the best. Wasn't it you who told me that the most successful attorneys are the ones who prepare for contingencies others don't see coming? A flicker of something, respect, anger, both, crossed his face. And if I need time to consider these options? You have until noon tomorrow, I replied. After my mother's funeral. I think that's appropriately symbolic, don't you? Burying the past before moving forward. Andrew's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to ultimatums, especially not from me. For nearly 2 decades, I had been the one to compromise, to accommodate his ambitions, to make our life work around his needs. The power shift was palpable in the room. And in the meantime? He asked stiffly. In the meantime, I'll be staying here, in our home, preparing to lay my mother to rest. I stood, straightening my blouse with deliberate care. You, however, should find other accommodations. I believe Rebecca has a very nice condo in Riverside. Heights! The doorman there is quite friendly. He always greets you by name when you arrive for your Tuesday evening visits. Andrew flinched visibly at this final piece of evidence. One more confirmation that I knew far more than he had suspected. This isn't over, he said, but it sounded hollow even to my ears. No, I agreed. But it is changing, just like the locks. He gathered his phone and keys, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. At the door, he paused, turning back with one last attempt to regain control. Your mother would be ashamed of how vindictive you've become, he said coldly. I smiled then, a genuine smile that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. My mother taught me to prepare for storms before the sky darkens, I replied. She would be proud that I listened. The door closed behind him with a decisive click. I remained standing in the living room, surrounded by furniture I hadn't chosen and artwork I didn't recognize, feeling more at home than I had in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Margot. Meeting confirmed with Harrison at 10. Forensic. Accountant report ready. How did it go with Andrew? I typed back a simple reply. Exactly as we expected. He's running scenarios now. We'll decide by tomorrow. Margot's response came immediately. And if he chooses poorly? I looked around at the house Andrew had tried to remake in his absence, at the space he had attempted to claim as his own. My house, my life, my terms now. Then we proceed to Plan C, I texted back. But he won't. Andrew has always prioritized self-preservation above all else. I set the phone down and moved to the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. There was still so much to do before tomorrow. Funeral arrangements to finalize, family to coordinate, a statement to prepare for my mother's service. But for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Andrew had changed the locks thinking he was locking me out of my own life. Instead, he had inadvertently freed me from the prison of our marriage, a prison built so gradually that I hadn't fully recognized the bars until I found myself on the outside, looking in. After Andrew left, I moved through the house with new purpose, truly seeing the changes he had made. What had appeared at first glance to be simple redecorating now revealed itself as something more calculated, a systematic erasure of my presence, a rewriting of our shared history. In the living room, the built-in bookshelves that once held my law books, family photos, and treasured novels had been rearranged. My professional achievements, the framed certificate of my admission to the state bar, awards from my days at the firm, were nowhere to be seen. In their place were Andrew's golf trophies, business books, and the pretentious art pieces he'd always favored, but I'd resisted displaying. I opened cabinets and closets throughout the house, taking inventory. My grandmother's china, passed down through generations of women in my family, had been boxed up and relegated to the basement. The kitchen had been restocked with sleek modern appliances I'd never use, the kind featured in high-end design magazines, not the functional tools I preferred for my weekend baking. In the home office, the changes were even more telling. The desk we had once shared had been cleared of my materials. The filing cabinet where I kept important documents stood open, half empty. I knelt beside it, quickly checking the contents of each drawer. Most of my files remained, but several crucial folders were missing, those containing our property deeds, insurance policies, and investment information. I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still sent a chill through me. This wasn't just Andrew preparing to leave. This was Andrew systematically gathering ammunition, removing evidence, and positioning himself for maximum advantage. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Harrison Weber, my former law partner, and the only person from my previous firm I still trusted implicitly. Elena. His familiar voice was warm but businesslike. I've reviewed everything you sent. It's exactly as you suspected. I sank into the office chair, running my fingers along the unfamiliar grain of the new desk surface. Tell me. The withdrawal patterns match exactly with his travel schedule. He's been moving money incrementally to avoid triggering the bank's reporting requirements. The forged authorizations are amateurish. Anyone with forensic experience will spot them immediately. And the property records? Harrison hesitated. That's where it gets interesting. There's been an attempt to add Rebecca Myers to the deed of the Vermont cabin. My breath caught. How? That property is in my name only. A quit-claim deed was filed 6 weeks ago, supposedly signed by you, transferring partial ownership. But it hasn't been fully processed yet. The county clerk flagged it because the notary seal used doesn't match their records. It's currently under administrative review. I closed my eyes, absorbing this new information. The cabin had been my sanctuary, the one place I'd always felt truly at peace. Even attempting to claim it revealed The depth of Andrew's betrayal. What about the prenup? Has he found a way around it? He's trying, Harrison confirmed. His attorney, Martin Davies, by the way, not surprised he'd go with that shark, filed an initial brief challenging the enforceability of the agreement based on substantial changes in circumstances. Standard tactic, nothing we didn't anticipate. I nodded, even though Harrison couldn't see me. We had indeed anticipated this move. The prenuptial agreement had been Andrew's idea initially, when my family's modest wealth still exceeded his earning potential. Now that the situation was reversed, he wanted to invalidate the very protections he had once insisted upon. The forensic accountant's report is damning, Elena, Harrison continued. Clear evidence of systematic financial misconduct. If this goes to court, Andrew faces potential criminal charges, not just civil penalties. He knows that, I said quietly. Or at least, he's beginning to understand the position he's in. What's your next move? I glanced at the silver-framed photograph now sitting prominently on the desk. Andrew and his parents at some charity function, all perfect smiles and designer clothes. The notable absence of me in a frame that had once held our wedding photos spoke volumes. I've given him until noon tomorrow to decide. After Mom's funeral. Harrison's voice softened. How are you holding up with that? Do you need anything for tomorrow? The simple kindness in his question threatened to crack my carefully maintained composure. I swallowed hard before answering. I'm managing. Margot's handling most of the arrangements. I just need to get through the service. And then confront Andrew with his decision, Harrison added. Are you sure you don't want me there when you do? I considered the question, picturing the moment when Andrew would return, either humbled and ready to negotiate or, more likely, with a new strategy to regain control. No, I decided. This part I need to handle alone. But I'd like you standing. By just in case. Always, Harrison promised. Call me the moment you need me. After ending the call, I continued my assessment of the house, moving upstairs to the bedroom that had once been ours. The king-sized bed we had chosen together had been replaced with a sleeker, more masculine platform model. The soft blues and greens I had favored were gone, replaced with charcoal and navy. On what had been my nightstand, now a minimalist floating shelf, sat a framed photo I hadn't noticed before. I picked it up, studying it closely. Andrew and Rebecca at what appeared to be a company retreat, standing slightly apart from a group but angled toward each other, their body language revealing an intimacy that couldn't be disguised. The photo had been taken nearly 2 years ago. Their affair had been going on much longer than I had initially calculated. I set the frame down, face first on the shelf, and opened the closet door. As expected, my clothes had been removed. But something caught my eye on the top shelf. A small velvet box, hastily shoved behind some folded sweaters. Inside was exactly what I had described to Andrew earlier. An emerald-cut diamond ring, elegant and expensive. The engagement ring he had purchased for Rebecca, hidden in what had once been our bedroom. I closed the box and returned it exactly as I had found it. One more piece of evidence. One more confirmation that I had made the right choice in how to handle what was coming next. That evening, as I sat on the unfamiliar couch in what felt increasingly like a stranger's home, Margot arrived with dinner and determination. My younger sister had always been the fighter between us, quick to anger, quick to act, fiercely protective. Walking through the front door, her eyes swept over the changes to the house with growing indignation. That bastard, she muttered, setting down bags of takeout on the kitchen counter. He couldn't even wait until Mom was buried before redecorating? What happened to the photos from Santorini? And Dad's old reading chair? Storage, probably, I replied, helping her unpack the food. Or donated. He was very thorough. Margot's expression darkened. I should have known something was off when he barely visited Mom in the hospital. Remember when he suddenly had that emergency case the weekend her condition worsened? I nodded. the memory still raw. He was with Rebecca in Chicago. I found the hotel receipt. Margot stopped unpacking, her hands stilling on a container of pad thai. How long have you known Elena? About all of it? The question hung between us, layered with unspoken concerns. Had I been silent too long? Had I enabled Andrew's behavior by not confronting it sooner? I took a deep breath and began the explanation I had rehearsed so many times. I started noticing small discrepancies about 18 months ago, I said, methodically arranging plates on the counter. Money missing from the joint account, weekend work emergencies that couldn't be verified, new passwords on accounts we used to share. Why didn't you say something? Margot's voice held no judgment, only concern. At first, I thought I was imagining things, being paranoid. I smiled ruefully. Andrew has always been so good at making me question myself. He'd look at me with that patient expression and explain how I'd misunderstood, how I was being irrational. Margot snorted. Classic gaslighting. Exactly. But then Mom got sick, and suddenly I had clarity I hadn't felt in years. I moved to the living room, retrieving my laptop. Working with her financial affairs, helping her prepare, it reminded me of who I used to be before. Before Andrew? Margot finished softly. I nodded. Before I gradually set aside my career, my ambitions, my instincts to make room for his. I opened my laptop, pulling up a timeline I'd created, a meticulous documentation of our marriage's slow disintegration alongside Andrew's calculated moves. Look at this, I said, pointing to a series of entries from 2 years earlier. This is when it started changing noticeably. Andrew made senior partner. I cut back to part-time consultation to support his increased workload. Rebecca was assigned as his dedicated administrative assistant. Margot leaned closer, studying the screen. And 3 months later, the first unexplained hotel charge. Yes, and here, I scrolled forward 6 months, is when I confronted him about working too much, about the distance growing between us. He suggested marriage counseling. You went to counseling? Margot looked surprised. I'd never mentioned it to her. 6 sessions, during which Andrew convinced both me and the therapist that the problem was my insecurity about his success, my inability to adapt to his new position. I closed the laptop. 2 days after our last session, he opened the separate account he's been funneling money into. Margot's eyes flashed with anger. He used therapy to manipulate you. He used everything to manipulate me, I corrected gently. That's what I finally understood when Mom got sick. Watching her face her mortality with such clarity, such honesty, it made me see how much dishonesty I'd been accepting in my own life. I moved to the window, looking out at the darkening neighborhood. The same view I'd gazed at for 15 years, now framed by curtains I hadn't chosen. Mom knew, even through the pain medication and treatments. She would look at me during those long nights in the hospital and ask, "Is he still lying to you, Lainey?" Lainey, Mom's nickname for me since childhood. No one else ever used. She never trusted him, Margot said, coming to stand beside me. Not from the beginning. It was true. My mother, Catherine Mills, had seen through Andrew's charm from the first time I brought him home. She had never said so directly. That wasn't her way. But her reserved responses to his effusive compliments, her thoughtful gaze when he spoke about his ambitions, told me everything. Remember what she said at our rehearsal dinner? I asked, the memory suddenly vivid. After his toast about joining our families, Margot smiled sadly. Keep your name on something that matters, Eleanor. Always have a door only you can open. Thought she was being old-fashioned, I admitted. A remnant from her generation, from what happened with Dad. I had no idea she was trying to warn me. Our father had abandoned the family when I was 12 and Margot was 9, emptying the bank accounts and disappearing with his secretary. Mom had been left with nothing but her teacher's salary and the small cabin her father had left her. The same cabin Andrew was now trying to claim. That's why you kept the house in your name, Margot realized. And the cabin. I nodded. The only things Mom insisted on when we reviewed the prenup. Property is power, she told me. Don't give away your foundations. A comfortable silence fell between us as we both remembered our mother, her quiet strength, her careful preparations, her ability to build a life from the ashes of betrayal. She'd be proud of you, Margot said finally, handling this the way you are. Not falling apart, you mean? Not just that. Being strategic, using your strengths. Andrew always underestimated you because you let him. Mom knew what you were capable of. I thought about the last coherent conversation I'd had with my mother, just 3 weeks ago. Her hand, paper thin and cool, gripping mine with surprising strength as she pulled me close to her hospital bed. "Remember the storm shutters, Lainey," she had whispered, her voice raspy from the breathing tubes. At first, I thought it was confusion, her mind wandering to the cabin where we'd spent summers battening down the hatches before northeastern gales swept in. "The shutters, Mom? You always prepare before the winds come," she had said, her gaze suddenly clear and piercing. "Not during, not after, before." I had nodded, tears threatening. "He's coming for the cabin," she continued. "I can feel it. Storms brewing. Are your shutters ready?" That night, I had gone home and begun my systematic documentation of Andrew's activities. Not just the financial discrepancies I had already noticed, but everything: phone records, emails I could access, conversations, absences. I had contacted Harrison, arranged for a private investigator, and begun quietly preparing for the storm my mother had sensed approaching. 2 days later, she had slipped into the coma from which she would never wake. She knew, I told Margot now. Somehow she knew what was coming. Mom always did, Margot agreed. Remember how she used to say that storms announce themselves if you're paying attention? The shift in the air, the change in the bird's behavior, the quality of light. I nodded, thinking of the subtle shifts in Andrew's behavior over the past 2 years. Less affection, more criticism, increasing secrecy. The signs had been there all along. I had simply learned not to notice them. "Theor, funeral's at 11 tomorrow," Margot said, returning to the kitchen to finish unpacking our dinner. "Are you ready?" For saying goodbye to Mom? No. I joined her, reaching for plates. For what comes after? Absolutely. As we ate dinner together, we shared memories of our mother, her quiet resilience, her unexpected humor, her unwavering support. Through every challenge. With each story, I felt my resolve strengthening. Tomorrow would bring 2 endings: a final farewell to the woman who had shaped me, and the beginning of the end of a marriage built on increasingly shaky ground. Andrew had changed the locks thinking he could lock me out of my life. What he would discover tomorrow was that some doors can never be barred, especially when you've been given the keys by someone who saw the storm coming long before the first winds blew. The morning of my mother's funeral dawned with inappropriate beauty, clear skies, gentle breeze, the kind of autumn day she would have loved. I stood in front of the guest room mirror, adjusting the simple black dress I'd worn too many times these past few weeks. My reflection looked different somehow. The same features, but a new resolve in the eyes, a firmness around the mouth that hadn't been there before. Margot had stayed overnight, sleeping in the second guest room that Andrew had apparently been using as a home gym. She appeared in my doorway, already dressed in her own morning clothes, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Car's here," she said quietly. "You ready?" I nodded, gathering my small clutch purse. Inside was my mother's favorite photograph, the 3 of us at the cabin, laughing by the lake, taken the summer after my father left. Our first holiday as what Mom had called our complete family, not broken, not reduced, but complete in a new configuration. The service was everything Mom would have wanted: simple, dignified, focused on celebration rather than sorrow. The small chapel filled with her fellow teachers, former students, neighbors, and the few relatives we had left. I delivered the eulogy with a steady voice, sharing stories of Catherine Mill's quiet strength, her dedication to her students, and family, her ability to find joy in small moments. Andrew arrived exactly 7 minutes before the service began, slipping into a pew near the back. He wore an appropriately somber gray suit, his expression a carefully constructed mask of respectful grief. From my position at the front, I could see him noting who attended, who spoke, who seemed most affected, always gathering information, always looking for leverage. He didn't approach me during the service or at the graveside. Only at the small reception afterward, held at my aunt's house, did he finally make his way to where I stood speaking with one of Mom's oldest friends. "Elena," he said softly, touching my elbow with practiced concern. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Catherine was a remarkable woman." The friend, sensing the tension beneath his polite words, excused herself with a sympathetic squeeze of my hand. "Thank you for coming," I replied, my voice neutral. Professional, the same tone I would use with a distant acquaintance. Andrew shifted slightly, uncomfortable with my calm demeanor. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected." A moment of awkward silence stretched between us. In previous years, Andrew would have filled such moments immediately, smooth and charming, directing the conversation where he wanted it to go. Now he seemed unsure, off balance. "Have you considered what we discussed?" he finally asked, lowering his voice. "I have," I replied. "Have you?" Before he could answer, Margot appeared at my side, her presence like a shield. "Elena, Aunt Sarah is looking for you." Something about Mom's favorite brooch for the memory table. Andrew's jaw tightened at the interruption. "I need to speak with Elena privately, Margot. Family business." Margot's smile was glacial. "I am her family, Andrew. You're just the man who changed the locks while her mother was dying." He flinched, visibly at her bluntness. "That's not—" "I'll find you before I leave," I interrupted, placing a hand on Margot's arm to calm her. "We can talk then." He hesitated, then nodded stiffly and moved away toward the drink table. I watched him pour himself a generous scotch, noting how several people shifted away as he approached. "He's made his decision," Margot observed quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "He's going to fight." The reception continued, a subdued gathering of people sharing memories of my mother. I moved through the conversations mechanically, accepting condolences, thanking people for coming, performing the rituals of grief while my mind remained fixed on the confrontation to come. At precisely noon, the deadline I had given Andrew, I found him in my aunt's study, examining the family photos on her desk with idle curiosity. "Your aunt has known Rebecca for some time," he commented without turning around. He picked up a framed photo. "She was one of your mother's students, apparently. Small world." I closed the door behind me. "Not that small. Mom taught English at the only high school in town for 30 years. She taught half the people in this house." Andrew set the photo down and turned to face me. His expression had changed, the mask of sympathy replaced by cool calculation. This was the Andrew I had come to know in recent years, the one who emerged when negotiations turned serious. "I've thought about your proposal," he said, straightening his tie. "It's unacceptable." I hadn't expected otherwise, but hearing him say it still sent a small chill through me. "I see. Instead, I'm prepared to offer a counter-proposal." He reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. "My attorney has drafted a preliminary settlement agreement. It's quite generous, all things considered." I took the document but didn't open it. "All things considered?" "Yes." His confidence was returning, bolstered by familiar territory. given your unstable emotional state, your reduced earning capacity, and the fact that the majority of our marital assets derived from my income, I believe this represents a fair division. I slipped the document into my purse without reading it. And the unauthorized transfers? The forged signatures? The attempt to claim my family's cabin? A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Those matters are addressed in the agreement. I'm willing to overlook your baseless accusations in the interest of an amicable separation. Overlook. The word hung between us. That's very generous of you, Andrew. He didn't catch the edge in my voice. I think so. I'm also willing to allow you to remain in the house for 30 days while you secure new accommodations. That should be sufficient time. Allow me, I repeated, my voice steady, to remain in my house, the house that is solely in my name. Now, he heard it, the steel beneath the calm. His eyes narrowed. The house is a marital asset regardless of whose name is on the deed, he said. My income paid the mortgage, the taxes, the renovations. Any court will recognize my substantial contribution. Any court will also recognize federal bank fraud, Andrew, and forgery, and attempted property theft. His face hardened. You don't want to do this, Elena. You don't want to drag our private affairs into court. No, I agreed. I don't. That's why I offered you an alternative yesterday. An alternative that would leave me with hardly anything to show for 20 years of marriage. The mask slipped further, revealing a flash of the anger underneath. While you walk away with the house, the cabin, and half of everything I've earned. Everything we've earned, I corrected quietly. And yes, a fair division of our actual marital assets. Not what you've decided is fair after systematically siphoning money for months. Andrew took a step closer, using his height to attempt to intimidate me. It was a tactic he'd employed in the past when discussions weren't going his way. You've changed, Elena. Your mother's illness has made you bitter, vindictive. I held my ground, looking up at him calmly. No, Andrew. It made me clear-sighted. There's a difference. Is that why you've been spying on me? Having me followed? Collecting your little dossier of evidence? His voice had taken on a mocking edge. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That Rebecca wouldn't notice the distinctive car that kept showing up outside her condo? This was new information. Rebecca had spotted the private investigator. I filed it away without changing my expression. If you have nothing to hide, surveillance shouldn't concern you, I said mildly. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. Always the attorney. Even now you can't help but cross-examine. And you can't help but deflect, I countered. You haven't answered my question from yesterday. What happens to the $70,000 you've already taken? The forged documents? The fraudulent attempt to transfer my property? Andrew's jaw worked as he considered his response. Those allegations would be difficult to prove in court. They really wouldn't. I reached into my purse and removed a slim envelope. This is for you. He took it suspiciously. What is it? Open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a statement from the bank confirming the freezing of the secret account Andrew had established, pending investigation of suspected fraudulent activity. The color drained from his face as he read it. You can't do this. I didn't, I replied. The bank did, after I reported the unauthorized transfers and submitted evidence of the forged signatures. They're required by law to investigate potential fraud, Andrew. As an attorney, you should know that. You reported me to the bank? His voice rose in disbelief. On the day of your mother's funeral? No. I reported the fraudulent activity 3 days ago when I returned from the hospice. The bank acted according to their standard protocols. I took the paper from his now slack fingers. Their fraud department has already forwarded the case to the appropriate authorities. Andrew stared at me, his composure finally cracking completely. You're bluffing. I told you yesterday I don't bluff. I stepped back, creating distance between us. The account is frozen. The investigation is underway. The only question remaining is how we proceed from here. You've just destroyed any chance of an amicable settlement, he hissed, his face flushing with anger. Your attorney will advise you to cooperate fully with the investigation, I interrupted calmly. Because Martin Davies, for all his shark-like tactics, knows that financial fraud charges would end your legal career permanently. The Bar Association takes a very dim view of attorneys who commit felonies, Andrew. His hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me, something he had never done in all our years together. Instead, he drew a deep breath, visibly struggling to regain control. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice low and tense. It was the same question he had asked yesterday in our kitchen, but now it carried different weight. Now he understood what he was truly facing. Exactly what I proposed yesterday, I replied. Return every dollar you took without authorization. Agree to an equitable division of our actual marital assets. Leave my house. Drop any claim to my family's cabin. And if I agree, then I won't press criminal charges for the fraud and forgery. The evidence remains private. Your career remains intact. I held his gaze steadily. The same offer as before. The same terms. The only difference is that now you understand I'm not making empty threats. Andrew stared at me, seeing me clearly perhaps for the first time in years. Not the accommodating wife who had gradually diminished herself to make room for his ambitions, but the attorney I had once been, strategic, thorough, uncompromising when necessary. I'll need to consult with my lawyer, he said finally. Of course. You have 24 hours. I moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Andrew. What? He asked warily. The new locks you had installed? I've already called a locksmith to change them again. Your key won't work after today. I left him standing in my aunt's study, surrounded by photos of the family. He had attempted to wound on their darkest day. Outside, mourners were beginning to depart, the small gathering winding down as afternoon shadows lengthened across the lawn. Margot found me on the porch, her eyes searching my face. Well? The first domino has fallen, I said quietly. He knows now what he's really facing. She slipped her arm through mine, a gesture of solidarity. And what's that exactly? I looked out at the autumn day my mother would have loved, feeling her presence in the gentle breeze, the quality of light, the changing leaves. Consequences, I replied. For the first time in his life, actual consequences. The morning after the funeral, I sat in Harrison Weber's corner office overlooking the city, watching as he reviewed the document Andrew had given me. Harrison's expression remained professionally neutral, but the slight tightening around his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This is, he began, then paused, searching for an appropriate word. Insulting, I suggested. I was going to say delusional, Harrison replied, setting the proposal aside. He's offering you approximately 20% of your actual entitlement, while asking you to waive any claims regarding his financial misconduct. The office door opened, and Margot entered with James Littleton, the forensic accountant Harrison had engaged on my behalf. Margot had insisted on attending this meeting, despite having to take another day off from her teaching job. Family first, she'd said firmly. Mom would expect nothing less. James, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the precise movements of someone accustomed to examining details, set a thick folder on Harrison's desk. The complete analysis as requested, he said, taking a seat. And I must say, Mrs. Carter, this is one of the more brazen attempts at financial concealment I've documented in my career. Elena, please, I corrected gently. And I'm not surprised. Andrew has always believed he's the smartest person in any room. James nodded, opening the folder. The account statements you provided show a clear pattern of strategic withdrawals designed to stay just under reporting thresholds. But what's particularly interesting is where the money went afterward. Harrison leaned forward. You were able to trace it? Most of it, James confirmed. Approximately $40,000 was transferred to an LLC registered in Delaware, Silver Ridge Ventures. The LLC then purchased various assets: designer watches, art, cryptocurrency. Items that retain value but don't appear in standard marital property declarations. And the remaining $30,000? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. James adjusted his glasses. Transferred to a joint account opened 6 months ago in the names of Andrew Carter and Rebecca Myers. That account has funded several significant purchases, including a down payment on a condominium in Riverside Heights. Margot swore under her breath. He's been setting up their life together with your money. Our money, I corrected, more out of habit than any desire to defend Andrew. Marital assets. Harrison made a note in his legal pad. The joint account with Ms. Myers is particularly problematic from a legal standpoint. It clearly establishes intent to divert marital assets for the benefit of a third party. What about the cabin? I asked, thinking of my grandfather's property, the one place that had always remained mine alone. James exchanged glances with Harrison before responding. The attempted transfer of the Vermont property is concerning. The quitclaim deed was professionally prepared, but the execution was flawed. Whoever forged your signature didn't account for the county clerk's verification protocols. Rebecca, Margot said with certainty. It has to be. Andrew wouldn't risk his own handwriting on a forgery. I nodded, remembering the distinctive handwriting on the boxes of my belongings. She's been involved in more than just the affair. She's been helping him execute this entire plan. Harrison gathered the documents, his expression grave. Elena, this evidence is substantial. Combined with the bank's independent investigation, we have more than enough to proceed with both civil and criminal complaints, which would destroy Andrew's career, I murmured, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of the stakes. Without question, Harrison confirmed. The Bar Association would initiate disbarment proceedings immediately upon formal charges being filed. I rose from my chair and moved to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Andrew was likely in his own attorney's office, weighing options, calculating risks. Always the strategist, always 3 moves ahead, or so he thought. He won't agree to my terms, I said finally. Not willingly. He'll try to find a third option, a way to mitigate the damage without full capitulation. Then we proceed to court, Harrison said simply. The evidence is on our side. I turned back to face them, these allies who had rallied around me when I needed them most. There's something else we need to consider, something I discovered when I was going through the house. From my purse, I withdrew a small thumb drive. This was hidden in Andrew's home office, taped behind the file cabinet. It contains financial records for another account I wasn't previously aware of, one holding nearly $200,000. James looked startled. That wasn't in any of the records you provided. Because I only found it yesterday morning before the funeral. I made a copy of the drive but left the original where I found it. I wanted to see if Andrew would move it once he realized I was serious about the investigation. Harrison took the drive, his expression impressed. What's on it exactly? Records of an offshore account in the Caymans, I explained. But more importantly, communications between Andrew and Martin Davies discussing how to hide assets during a potential divorce. Dating back nearly 14 months, Margot's eyes widened. He's been planning this for over a year? It appears so, I confirmed. And he's been using his law firm's resources to do it. Martin has been advising him in an unofficial capacity while continuing to bill the firm for his hours. Harrison whistled, softly. That's a serious ethics violation. If his firm discovers this, they will, I interrupted. Because I've scheduled a meeting with the managing partners tomorrow morning. A moment of stunned silence followed my announcement. Elena, Harrison said carefully, that's a significant escalation. Once you take this to his firm, there's no turning back, no possibility of a quiet resolution. I know. Are you sure this is how you want to proceed? He pressed. We could use this information as leverage in negotiations without actually taking it to the firm. I considered his question carefully, thinking of all the moments that had led to this decision. Andrew's calculated betrayal, his attempt to steal my family property, his deliberate timing of moving against me while I sat with my dying mother, the systematic erasure of my presence from our home, the cold planning that had gone into dismantling our marriage while presenting a supportive facade. I'm sure, I said finally. Andrew changed the locks while I was at my mother's deathbed. He removed my photographs, boxed up my belongings, and tried to steal my inheritance while I was saying goodbye to the most important person in my life. I took a deep breath, feeling the clarity my mother had always embodied settling into my bones. He didn't just break my trust, Harrison. He tried to break me. And he did it with premeditation, with professional assistance, and with absolute disregard for basic human decency. Margot reached over and squeezed my hand. The time for quiet resolutions ended when he changed those locks, I continued. Now, it's time for him to understand exactly what he set in motion. Harrison nodded slowly. Then we'll proceed accordingly. I'll prepare the necessary documents for tomorrow's meeting. As we finalized our strategy, outlining the steps ahead, I felt a strange sense of peace, not happiness. There was nothing joyful about the dissolution of 20 years of marriage, but certainty. The path ahead was clear, the alliance strong, the evidence irrefutable. Andrew had locked me out of our home, thinking he was locking me out of power. Instead, he had inadvertently freed me to reclaim it. The locksmith had just finished installing new deadbolts when my phone rang. Unknown number. Eleanor Mills Carter, I answered, using my full name, something I'd stopped doing years ago when Andrew suggested it sounded too formal for a part-time consultant. Elena. Rebecca Myers's voice was tightly controlled, professional. I think we need to talk. I watched the locksmith pack his tools, handing him cash for his expedited service. Do we? I kept my tone neutral, betraying nothing of the surprise I felt at her direct approach. This situation has become complicated. Pause. I believe we could benefit from a conversation without the attorneys present. I thanked the locksmith as he left, closing the door behind him and testing the new lock. I don't see what we would have to discuss, Rebecca. Your relationship with my husband isn't my primary concern at the moment. This isn't about Andrew. Another pause, longer this time. It's about the cabin. My breath caught. The Vermont property. My grandfather's legacy. What about it? I have information you should be aware of. Information that changes things. I considered hanging up. This could easily be a trap. A strategy devised by Andrew to gather information or create a scenario he could later misrepresent. Yet, something in Rebecca's voice, a tension, an urgency, made me hesitate. I'm listening. Not over the phone, she insisted. Can we meet? Somewhere public. I glanced at my watch. It was just after 4. My meeting with the partners at Andrew's firm was scheduled for 9 the next morning. The coffee shop at the public library. 5 o'clock. I'll be there. She hung up without another word. I stood in the entryway of my newly secured home, weighing the risks against potential benefits. Rebecca had been Andrew's accomplice, perhaps even the architect of some aspects of his plan. Meeting her alone was potentially dangerous, not physically, but strategically. I called Margot. She reached out to you? My sister sounded incredulous. That's either very bold or very desperate. Maybe both, I replied, already moving upstairs to change. Something about the cabin. She says she has information. It's a trap, Margot said flatly. Andrew sent her to feel you out, see what you know. Possibly. I pulled a sweater from the guest room closet, one of the few items of my clothing Andrew hadn't packed away. But what if it's not? What if she's realized she's in as much legal jeopardy as he is? Margot was silent for a moment. You're going to meet her regardless of what I say, aren't you? Yes, I admitted. But I'll be careful. Public place, no commitments, no signatures on anything. I'm coming with you, Margot decided. I'll sit nearby. If anything seems off, I'll intervene. I smiled at my sister's protectiveness. Agreed. But let me handle the conversation unless I signal otherwise. How will I know the signal? I'll order a second coffee, I said. I never order a second coffee. 30 minutes later, I sat at a corner table in the library's small cafe, positioned to see both the main entrance and the emergency exit. Rebecca arrived precisely at 5, dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit that probably cost more than most administrative assistants could afford. I noted the detail without judgment. Another piece in the puzzle of her relationship with Andrew. She spotted me immediately, nodding slightly as she ordered at the counter before approaching my table. Thank you for meeting me, she said, setting down her cup and taking the seat opposite. No handbag, I noted. Just a slim leather portfolio that she placed precisely on the table between us. You mentioned information about my family's cabin, I replied, skipping the pleasantries. I'm curious what you think you know about my property. Rebecca took a sip of her coffee, perfectly manicured fingers steady around the cup. I know that Andrew attempted to transfer partial ownership to himself using a forged document, a document he asked me to notarize. I kept my expression neutral despite the confirmation of what we had suspected. And did you? No. She set the cup down. I refused. That's when he went to someone else, a notary at his firm who didn't ask questions. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Why are you telling me this? Because the FBI came to my apartment this morning asking very similar questions. She opened the portfolio and removed a business card, sliding it across the table to me. Special Agent Diana Mercer, Financial Crimes Division. I see. I examined the card briefly before looking back at her. And what did you tell them? The truth. That Andrew asked me to notarize a document with what he claimed was your signature, that I refused when I realized you hadn't actually signed it, and that he then used other means to complete the forgery. I leaned back slightly, processing this information. That's a serious admission, Rebecca. One that implicates Andrew in federal fraud. I'm aware. She met my gaze directly for the first time. I've retained separate counsel as of this morning. Now, we were getting to it. And what does your counsel advise regarding your own involvement in other aspects of Andrew's financial activities? A slight flush appeared on her cheeks. My involvement was limited. I knew about the separate accounts. I assisted with some of the transfers, but I was not aware of the full extent of what he was doing until recently. Recently, I repeated. Would that be before or after you helped him redecorate my house while I was at my mother's hospice bedside? The CEO flush deepened. I deserve that, but believe it or not, that's not why I asked to meet you. Then why? Rebecca opened the portfolio again and removed a USB drive similar to the one I had discovered behind Andrew's file cabinet. Because of what's on here. She placed it on the table between us. Andrew didn't just try to take half ownership of your cabin, Elena. He was in the process of selling it outright. My heart seemed to stop for a moment. That's not possible. He couldn't sell property that isn't his. With the right documentation, he could. Documentation he's been creating for months. She tapped the drive. Purchase offers, inspection reports, closing documents, all waiting for the quitclaim deed to be processed so he could move forward. He already has a buyer lined up through an associate at the firm. I stared at the small drive, feeling as though the floor was shifting beneath me. Why would he do this? The cabin isn't particularly valuable, not compared to our other assets. Rebecca hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. It's not about the cabin itself. It's about what's on the land. What are you talking about? It's just 5 acres of woodland by a lake. 5 acres that a development company has been trying to acquire for years. 5 acres that, along with similar parcels they've already purchased, would allow them to build a luxury resort complex on the lake. I shook my head in disbelief. That's absurd. The area is protected by conservation easements. No large development could be approved. Unless the right people received the right incentives to modify those easements. Rebecca pushed the drive closer to me. The development company is a client of Andrew's firm. They've been working on this project quietly for over 2 years, acquiring property piece by piece through shell companies to avoid raising local concerns. I picked up the drive, turning it over in my fingers as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about Andrew trying to take my property. This was about him potentially using insider information from his firm to profit from a development deal at the expense of my family legacy. "How much?" I asked quietly. "The offer on the table is $1.2 million, Rebecca replied, with a 10% finder's fee for Andrew, $120,000, more than the amount he had already siphoned from our accounts. "And you know all this because I've been handling the paperwork, creating the files, managing the communications." She met my gaze again, her expression unreadable. "I've been very good at my job, Elena. Perhaps too good." I slipped the drive into my pocket, still processing the magnitude of what she was telling me. "Why are you giving me this now? What changed?" Rebecca closed the portfolio, her movements precise. "The FBI showing up at my door was a wake-up call. I knew Andrew was planning to leave you. I knew about the accounts, the property transfer. I told myself it was just a messy divorce, not my concern beyond the tasks he assigned me." She paused, her professional composure slipping slightly. "But fraud? Federal charges? That's not what I signed up for." And when I realized he had approached someone else to notarize the document I had refused to handle, "You realized you might be implicated as well," I finished for her. She nodded, a single sharp movement. "My attorney advised full cooperation with the federal investigation. Part of that includes disclosing everything I know about Andrew's activities." "Including this meeting?" I asked. "Yes, Agent Mercer is aware I'm speaking with you." She hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Something not on the drive." I waited, watching her internal struggle play across her carefully maintained features. "Andrew isn't planning to contest the divorce anymore," she said finally. "He's planning to disappear." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, disappear?" "He has a passport in another name. Banking details established overseas. A contact in South America who can help him establish a new identity." She lowered her voice further. "He told me last night that if things went badly with his attorney today, we would need to accelerate our timeline." "We?" I repeated. "You were planning to go with him?" Rebecca looked away for the first time. "That was his expectation. But not yours?" "I thought we were building a life together," she said quietly. "I didn't realize I was just another asset in his exit strategy until it was too late." I considered her words, searching for manipulation or deception. Instead, I saw something unexpected. A woman coming to terms with her own exploitation by the same man who had spent years diminishing me. "Have you told the FBI about his plans to leave the country?" She nodded. "This morning. They're monitoring his movements, his accounts. But he's careful, Elena, methodical. If he suspects they're watching, he'll find another way out," I finished, knowing all too well how Andrew operated. "Thank you for this information, Rebecca. I know it couldn't have been easy to come forward." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Don't thank me. If the FBI hadn't knocked on my door, I'd still be helping him pack for our new life together." She stood, straightening her jacket with practiced precision. "I should go. My attorney is expecting an update." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Rebecca." She paused, looking back. How long? I asked. How long were you and Andrew? 2 years, she replied after a moment. Though he'd been laying the groundwork for longer, creating situations where we'd work late together. Building a narrative about how unhappy he was at home, how you didn't understand his ambitions. The time frame matched precisely with my own documentation. 2 years of deception, of strategic manipulation, of carefully constructed lies. He told me you were cold, Rebecca continued, a strange need for confession evident in her voice. Distant, uninterested in his work, that you were satisfied with a mediocre life while he wanted more. I nodded, unsurprised. And the money? The accounts? When did that start? About 14 months ago. Small transfers at first, then larger amounts as he grew more confident you wouldn't notice. She hesitated. He said you never looked at the finances, that you were content to let him handle everything. Another lie. I had been deliberately excluded from our financial management, my access to accounts gradually restricted under the guise of simplifying our affairs. One more question, I said as she again turned to leave. The photographs, the ones he removed from our home. Do you know what happened to them? Something like shame flickered across her face. He burned them, in the fire pit at his fishing cabin. She met my eyes one last time. I'm sorry, Elena, whatever that's worth. After she left, I remained at the table, the USB drive heavy in my pocket. Margot approached from a nearby table, sliding into the seat Rebecca had vacated. Well? She asked, her expression concerned. Was it a trap? I shook my head slowly. No, it was something else entirely. I pulled out the drive, setting it on the table between us. It seems Andrew's betrayal goes deeper than either of us imagined. As I explained what Rebecca had told. Me, the development plan, the pending sale, Andrew's preparation to flee the country, Margot's expression shifted from concern to shock to cold anger. The cabin, she whispered, understanding the significance immediately. Mom's favorite place. The one place she insisted you keep in your name only. The one place she trusted would always be ours, I agreed. And he was going to sell it out from under me while I grieved her death. Margot reached across the table, gripping my hand tightly. What are you going to do? I thought of my meeting with the law firm partners the next morning, of the evidence already gathered, of Andrew, somewhere in the city, unaware that his carefully constructed escape plan had just been exposed. Exactly what Mom taught us, I replied. When a storm is coming, you don't run from it. I squeezed her hand in return. You face it head on. The Donovan, Reed, and Matheson law offices occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise. As the elevator carried me upward, I felt a strange sense of calm. Beside me, Harrison adjusted his tie, his expression professionally neutral, despite the gravity of our mission. You're sure about this? He asked quietly. Once we present this evidence to the partners. I'm sure, I replied, clutching the leather portfolio containing everything we had gathered. Bank records, forgery evidence, the real estate scheme, Rebecca's signed statement, and the thumb drives, both the one I had found and the one Rebecca had provided. The elevator doors opened to a reception area designed to impress. Marble floors, original artwork, discreet lighting that spoke of power and success. Andrew had always been proud to be part of this firm, seeing his partnership as validation of his ambitions. William Reed, the managing partner, met us personally, a courtesy that indicated the seriousness with which they were taking this meeting. At 68, Reed had the gravitas of someone who had spent decades winning impossible cases. His handshake was firm, his assessment of me swift and calculating. Mrs. Carter, he said, and Mr. Weber, please, this way. He led us to the main conference room where 3 other partners waited. Catherine Donovan, the firm's founder, Michael, Stern, head of corporate law, and James Littleton, whom I recognized as our forensic accountant. I hadn't expected his presence, But it made sense. The firm would want their own expert to verify our claims. "Thank you for meeting with us," I began as we took our seats. "I understand this is an unusual situation." Indeed. Catherine Donovan's voice was cool, her expression unreadable. "You've made serious allegations against one of our senior partners. We're here to understand the basis for these claims." Harrison opened the portfolio between us. "We have comprehensive documentation of Mr. Carter's activities that, I must emphasize, potentially implicate this firm in several areas of liability." Reed's eyebrows rose slightly. "Liability?" Mr. Carter used firm resources, including staff and technology systems, to execute financial fraud, forgery, and a real estate scheme involving one of your corporate clients. Harrison pushed the first set of documents across the table. "This is merely an overview. The full evidence file has been provided to Mr. Littleton for verification." The partners exchanged glances as they reviewed the summary document. Stern was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger. "These allegations involve Northlake Development, one of our biggest clients?" I nodded. "Andrew attempted to sell them my family property he had no legal right to, using forged documents created on firm systems. He planned to collect a substantial finder's fee without disclosing his personal interest in the transaction." Catherine Donovan's expression hardened as she continued reading. "And you have proof of this? Definitive proof?" In answer, I placed the 2 thumb drives on the table. "Everything is here, including communications between Andrew and Martin Davies, discussing how to hide assets during our divorce." At the mention of Davies, Reed's face darkened. Davies was advising him on this? Unofficially? "While billing the firm for his hours," I confirmed. "Yes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I could almost see the calculations running behind their eyes, assessing damage, liability, public relations implications. This wasn't just about Andrew anymore. This was about the firm's reputation, their relationship with a major client, potential malpractice issues. Stern closed the folder with a decisive movement. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Weber, would you excuse us for a few minutes?" We were shown to a smaller conference room where Harrison and I waited in silence. 20 minutes later, William, Reed himself, came to escort us back. "We've reviewed enough to take immediate action," he said without preamble. "Andrew Carter's partnership is suspended, effective immediately. His office is being secured as we speak, and our IT department is preserving all relevant electronic records." I nodded, not quite trusting myself to speak. "There will be a formal investigation, of course," Reed continued. "But I want to personally assure you that this firm does not condone or protect the kind of behavior documented here." "And Martin Davies?" Harrison asked. "Also suspended pending investigation." Reed's expression was grim. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you have also filed complaints with regulatory authorities?" "Yes. The bank's fraud department, the Bar Association, and as of this morning, the FBI." Reed nodded slowly. "Then I believe what happens next is largely out of our hands. But this firm will cooperate fully with all investigations." As we prepared to leave, Catherine Donovan approached me. "Elena," she said quietly, "I knew your work before you stepped back from your career. You were an exceptional attorney." She handed me her business card. "When this is resolved, I'd like to talk about your future plans." I took the card, surprised by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you," I replied. "But I think my future lies elsewhere." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps. But remember that options are power, something I suspect you're relearning." As Harrison and I left the building, my phone buzzed with a text from Margot. "FBI at Andrew's office. He's being escorted out." The storm had broken, and unlike what Andrew had planned for me, he hadn't seen it coming at all. Andrew's arrest made the evening news. Not the lead story, but substantial enough coverage for a respected attorney being led from his prestigious firm in handcuffs, charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. I watched the coverage from my living room, my reclaimed living room, where I had spent the afternoon removing the artwork Andrew had chosen and unpacking my own belongings from the boxes he'd prepared for my exit. The reporter's voice was neutral as she outlined the basics of the case, careful to include the obligatory alleged before each description of Andrew's crimes. What the news couldn't capture was the swift collapse of Andrew's carefully constructed plan. Within hours of our meeting with the partners, the dominoes had fallen exactly as I had anticipated. Andrew had been called to an emergency meeting, confronted with the evidence, and was still in the conference room when FBI agents arrived with a warrant. According to Margot's sources, her best friend's husband worked security in the building. Andrew had attempted to destroy his phone when agents appeared, leading to additional obstruction charges. My doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. Harrison stood on the porch, looking simultaneously exhausted and energized. "It's done," he said as I let him in. "Davies has turned on Andrew completely, offering everything he knows in exchange for leniency." I led him to the kitchen where I'd prepared a simple dinner. Nothing elaborate, just soup and sandwiches, but my first real meal in my own home since returning from the hospice. "That was fast," I commented, pouring us each a glass of wine. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Harrison accepted the glass with a nod of thanks. Davies claims Andrew was the mastermind, that he was merely providing standard legal advice without knowing the full context. And Rebecca? Full cooperation with federal authorities. In exchange, they're treating her as a witness rather than an accomplice. He took a careful sip. Her testimony about the real estate scheme is particularly damning. The development company is already distancing themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of Andrew's methods. I settled across from him at the kitchen island, stirring my soup absently. And the cabin? Safe. The county clerk has officially rejected the quitclaim deed as fraudulent. I've filed additional documentation confirming your sole ownership and added specific protections against future transfer attempts. Relief washed over me, more powerful than I had expected. The cabin had been my sanctuary since childhood, the place where Mom had taken us after Dad left, where we had healed as a family, where I had scattered some of her ashes just last week in a private ceremony with Margot. "What happens next?" I asked. Harrison set his glass down. "The criminal case will proceed regardless of what you decide about the divorce. Andrew's attorney has already reached out about a settlement. They want to negotiate? Now?" I couldn't help the disbelieving laugh that escaped me. "They're desperate," Harrison confirmed. "Andrew is facing potential disbarment, criminal charges, and civil liability. A clean divorce settlement is the least of his concerns, but it's one thing they might be able to resolve quickly." I considered this, thinking of the house around me, the cabin in Vermont, the life I had begun to reclaim, piece by piece. "What are they offering?" "Full restoration of all diverted funds. No claim on the house or the cabin. An equitable division of legitimate marital assets. And..." Harrison paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "A formal apology." "An apology," I repeated flatly. "For what exactly? Changing the locks? Trying to steal my inheritance? Planning to flee the country? Or perhaps for burning our family photographs while I sat with my dying mother?" Harrison had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's a standard legal tactic, Elena. They're trying to mitigate damages any way they can." I took a deep breath, calming myself. "I don't want his apology, Harrison. It's meaningless." "What do you want then?" The echo of Andrew's question, asked twice during our confrontations, wasn't lost on me. But unlike those encounters, I now had complete clarity about my answer. "I want what I asked for originally. Return of the stolen funds. No claims against my property. Fair division of our actual marital assets. I paused, considering. And I want the artwork. Harrison blinked in surprise. The artwork? The pieces he took from our walls, the ones that belonged to my family, the ones he replaced with his modern prints and abstract paintings. Understanding dawned in Harrison's eyes. Ah, the Callahan watercolors. Your grandfather's collection. I nodded. They were supposed to be in storage. I want confirmation they haven't been sold or disposed of. I'll add it to our counteroffer. Harrison made a note on his phone. Anything else? I thought of Andrew sitting in a holding cell, his reputation in tatters, his career imploding, his carefully crafted escape plan exposed and thwarted. What else could I possibly need? No, I said finally. Everything else he's losing on his own. The following afternoon, I received confirmation that Andrew had accepted our terms without modification. The divorce would proceed uncontested, the financial settlement as we had outlined. The Callahan watercolors would be returned within the week. They had indeed been in a storage unit, along with other family items Andrew had removed from our home. That evening, Special Agent Mercer called to update me on the federal investigation. Andrew had been released on bail but had surrendered his passport. The forensic analysis of his devices had uncovered additional evidence of financial misconduct stretching back further than even I had documented. We've frozen the offshore accounts, she informed me. And we've identified the contact who was helping him prepare his exit strategy, an associate at his firm with connections in Argentina. Is he still a flight risk? I asked, thinking of the elaborate escape Andrew had planned. We're monitoring him closely, Agent Mercer assured me. His movements, his communications, his finances, he's not going anywhere. After we hung up, I sat on my porch swing, the same swing Andrew had tried to replace with a sleeker, more modern design, and watched the sunset. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, unchanged by the drama that had unfolded within the walls of our house. My phone buzzed with a text from Margot. Justice served? I considered the question, thinking of Andrew's arrest, the criminal charges, the professional downfall, the divorce settlement. Was it justice? Perhaps. But it felt like something else entirely. Something less satisfying than vindication, but more profound than revenge. Not justice, I texted back. Consequences. Because that was what Andrew had truly needed to face. Not my anger, not my hurt, but the natural, inevitable consequences of his own choices. Consequences he had spent a lifetime believing he could outmaneuver, outsmart, or simply buy his way out of. For the first time since finding myself locked out of my own home, I felt a sense of completion. Not happiness exactly, but resolution. The locks had been changed again. The keys were in my possession alone, and the door that had once been barred, against me now opened only to my touch. 3 months after finding myself locked out of my home, I stood in the cabin's kitchen, hanging the last of the Callahan watercolors, a delicate rendering of the lake at sunrise, painted by my grandfather. Decades ago, the familiar image brought a sense of rightness, of things returned to their proper place. The divorce had been finalized with unusual speed, expedited by Andrew's legal troubles and his attorney's desire to resolve at least one aspect of his cascading problems. I hadn't seen him since the day after my mother's funeral, our communication conducted entirely through lawyers. According to Harrison, Andrew had lost everything. His partnership, his license to practice law, suspended pending, the criminal case, his reputation, and his freedom. The criminal trial was scheduled for spring, with federal prosecutors confident in their case. Rebecca had moved to Boston, taking a position with a smaller firm after providing her complete testimony. She had sent me a brief, formal note of apology, more sincere than anything Andrew might have offered, but still a reminder of her role in the deception that had nearly cost me everything. That's the last of them, Margot said, coming into the kitchen with an empty packing box. The bookshelves are filled, the linens are in the closets, and I found Mom's old recipe box behind the canned goods. I smiled, running my fingers over the watercolor's frame. It feels right, being here. More right than the house ever did. After finalizing the divorce, I had made a decision that surprised even myself. I was selling the house and moving permanently to the cabin. The property that Andrew had tried so desperately to take from me had become my sanctuary, my fresh start. "Are you sure about this career change?" Margot asked, settling onto one of the kitchen stools. Catherine Donovan's offer was pretty impressive. Full partner track? Your own department? I nodded, joining her at the counter where mugs of coffee waited. "I'm sure. I don't want to go back to corporate law, or to that city. Too many memories. Too many associations." What I didn't say, what I didn't need to say to Margot, was that the house had never stopped feeling contaminated by Andrew's presence, by his betrayal, by the systematic way he had tried to erase me from my own life. Even with new furniture, new paint, new locks, the space felt tainted. The cabin, by contrast, had remained purely mine. The one place Andrew had coveted, but never occupied. Never altered, never infected with his calculating presence. Besides, I continued, the position at Vermont Legal Aid is perfect. Using my skills to help people who actually need it. Living here by the lake, being close enough to visit you regularly. Margot smiled, reaching across to squeeze my hand. Mom would approve. She would, I agreed. She always said the cabin would save us if we let it. At the time, I had thought she meant financially. The property was valuable, even before the development company's interest. Now I understood she had meant something deeper. The cabin was more than an asset. It was a refuge, a connection to our past, a foundation for whatever came next. My phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. Criminal complaint filed against Martin Davies for ethics violations and conspiracy. Thought you'd want to know. Another domino falling, another consequence unfolding from Andrew's actions. Good news? Margot asked, noting my expression. Just more confirmation that the system sometimes works, I replied, setting the phone aside. When you have enough evidence and the right allies. We spent the afternoon putting final touches on the cabin, hanging curtains, arranging furniture, making the space fully mine again. The work was therapeutic, each decision a small reclamation of agency after years of gradual surrender to Andrew's preferences. As evening approached, we built a fire in the stone hearth and settled on the porch, with glasses of wine, watching as fog rolled gently across the lake surface. The peacefulness of the scene stood in stark contrast to the turmoil of recent months. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Mom hadn't gotten sick? Margot asked suddenly. If you hadn't spent those weeks with her at the hospice? I considered the question carefully. I think Andrew would have executed his plan eventually, maybe with different timing, different circumstances, but the outcome would have been the same. You being locked out of your own house? Me waking up, I corrected gently. That's what really happened, Margot. Being locked out was just the mechanism. What actually occurred was that I finally saw clearly what had been happening for years. The gradual erosion of my independence, the subtle undermining of my confidence, the careful isolation from friends and colleagues who might have noticed the changes in me. Andrew hadn't just planned a financial exit strategy. He had been psychologically preparing the ground for years. You know what still amazes me? I continued, watching the mist swirl over the water. Not the fraud or the forgery or even the affair. It's the timing. The deliberate choice to make his move while I was sitting with Mom in her final days. Margot's expression darkened. That's what makes it unforgivable. He could have left at any time, filed for divorce like a normal person. Instead, he saw your grief as an opportunity. An opportunity and a weapon, I agreed. He thought my emotional vulnerability would make me easier to manipulate, to control, to defeat. He miscalculated spectacularly. Margot said with grim satisfaction. Smiled, lifting my glass in a small toast. 2 miscalculations. And to Mom, Margot added, raising her own glass, who taught us to prepare for storms before they arrive. We fell silent, each lost in our own thoughts as darkness settled over the lake. The cabin creaked gently around us, familiar sounds from childhood summers and family gatherings, sounds that spoke of continuity, of endurance, of things that last despite life's upheavals. Tomorrow I would begin my new position at Vermont Legal Aid. Next weekend I would host my first dinner party in the cabin, Margot and her husband, Harrison, and his wife, my Aunt Sarah. Small steps toward a new normal, a reconfigured life. Andrew had changed the locks, thinking he was locking me out of my past. Instead, he had inadvertently freed me to unlock a different future, one he had never anticipated and could never touch. 1 year to the day after I found myself locked out of my home, I stood at the edge of the lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and rose. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, leaves beginning their transformation from green to vibrant reds and yellows. So much had changed in 12 months. The house in the city had sold for more than expected, providing additional financial security as I rebuilt my life. My position at Vermont Legal Aid had evolved into a leadership role, heading a new division focused on elder law and financial abuse prevention, issues that had taken on personal significance after what happened with my mother and Andrew. The criminal case against Andrew had concluded 3 months earlier with a guilty plea agreement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of both Rebecca and Martin Davies, he had finally accepted the inevitability of conviction. The sentence, 8 years in federal prison, restitution to various parties, permanent disbarment, reflected the severity and premeditation of his crimes. I hadn't attended the sentencing hearing. There was nothing I needed to see or hear from Andrew that could add anything meaningful to my life now. The formal closure of legal proceedings was just that, formal, external, a matter of public record rather than personal significance. My own closure had come much earlier, in quieter moments. Hanging my grandfather's watercolors in the cabin, reestablishing professional connections that had withered during my marriage, having dinner with friends without calculating how Andrew might interpret my enjoyment, making decisions based solely on my own preferences rather than anticipated criticism. I heard footsteps on the dock behind me and turned to see Harrison approaching, 2 coffee mugs in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering one of the steaming cups. "Margot said you'd been out here since dawn." I accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. Harrison and his wife were spending the weekend at the cabin, part of a growing tradition of regular gatherings that had helped transform the space from a symbol of what Andrew had tried to take to an emblem of what I had reclaimed. "Just thinking," I said, turning back to the lake. "It's been exactly a year today." Harrison nodded, understanding immediately. "A lot has changed." "Everything has changed," I corrected gently. "And somehow, at the same time, everything has returned to what it should have been all along." We stood in comfortable silence, watching a pair of loons glide across the lake's surface, their haunting calls echoing across the water. "I got a letter yesterday," I said finally, "from the development company. They're abandoning the resort project entirely. The Conservation Trust is purchasing the parcels they already acquired to ensure the land remains protected." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected good news. What changed their minds?" "Public opinion, mostly." Once the details of Andrew's scheme became public, local residents organized against the development. The company decided the negative publicity wasn't worth the potential profit. Another unintended consequence of Andrew's actions, his attempt to profit from selling my family's land, had ultimately ensured that the entire area would remain unspoiled for generations to come. "Have you heard anything from him?" Harrison asked, carefully, respecting the boundaries I had established around discussions of Andrew. I shook my head. No, and I don't expect to. There's nothing left to say. It was true. Whatever connection had once existed between us had been severed long before. I found myself unable to open my front door. The locks had merely been a physical manifestation of a barrier that had been growing for years. A barrier I now recognized I should have acknowledged much sooner. What about Rebecca? Harrison sipped his coffee, his tone carefully neutral. She's in Seattle now, started her own consulting firm. I shrugged slightly. Margot keeps tabs on her through mutual connections, says she seems to be doing well. I had made peace with Rebecca's role in what happened. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. She had been both collaborator and victim in Andrew's schemes, manipulated by the same skilled hands that had gradually diminished me over the years. The difference was that she had recognized the manipulation sooner, had chosen to break free rather than remain complicit. You know, Harrison said thoughtfully, when you first called me after finding yourself locked out, I expected anger, devastation, a desire for vengeance. I smiled at the memory of that call, made from my car in the driveway of what had once been my home. I was too shocked for anger then, too focused on what needed to be done. And now? A year later? I considered the question, watching the morning mist burn away as the sun climbed higher. Now I feel something I didn't expect. What's that? Gratitude, I said simply. Harrison looked surprised. For what happened? Not for what Andrew did, I clarified, but for what came after. For discovering strengths I had forgotten I possessed. For rebuilding connections I had allowed to wither. For creating a life that's authentically mine. I turned to face the cabin, my home, my sanctuary. Through the large windows, I could see Margot in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for our small gathering. Harrison's wife, Julie, was setting the table, laughing at something Margot had said. Mom used to say that sometimes you have to lose your way to find your path again, I continued. When Andrew changed those locks, he thought he was cutting me off from my life. What he actually did was force me to reclaim it. Harrison nodded slowly. From victim to victor. Not exactly, I corrected. That implies this was a battle, a competition. It wasn't. It was a liberation, painful and unexpected, but necessary. We began walking back toward the cabin, the scent of coffee and breakfast drawing us in from the crisp morning air. You know, what I realized recently? I said as we approached the porch steps. Andrew kept pushing me to give him a key to the cabin over the years. He claimed it was for emergencies, for practical reasons. I always found excuses to delay. Your subconscious, protecting what mattered, Harrison suggested. Maybe. Or maybe it was Mom's voice in my head, reminding me to keep something that was just mine. I paused at the door, hand on the knob. Either way, I'm glad I listened. Inside, the cabin was warm with morning light and friendly conversation. Margot looked up as we entered, her smile widening. Finally, we were about to send a search party. Breakfast is ready. As we gathered around the table, this small circle of people who had supported me through the darkest days and celebrated. The brightening ones, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was family, chosen, and blood. This was home, not because of property deeds or legal ownership, but because it sheltered what truly mattered. A year ago, I had stood on my former porch, key useless in my hand, locked out of what I thought was my life. The woman I had been then, grieving, exhausted, unsure, could never have imagined the strength she would discover, the clarity she would find, the life she would build from the wreckage of betrayal. Andrew had changed the locks, while I visited my dying mother. What he found when he returned home, what he faced in the aftermath of that cruel calculation, was something neither of us had anticipated. A woman who refused to be erased, who refused to be diminished, who refused to accept anything less than justice. What I found, in turn, was something even more valuable. Myself, reclaimed and renewed, with doors that opened only to keys I chose to create and share. The locks had changed, and so had I. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.